So what we're going to do is we're going to try and give you an overview of what it's like to work with Gypsy, Roma and Traveller children and their families. And we're going to sort of give you an overview of some information and then move on to think a little bit about a couple of cases that Holly and I have been involved in. So the first thing we want to do is we want to really just share that language is really important. And I know this has come up a number of times. I was part of the LGBTQI session last night, which was a brilliant session. And the panel there were really helpfully reminding us that language isn't neutral, it's not innocent. And so we need to make sure that we understand the language that we're using, and we need to be careful about the language we're using, and we need to engage with people at where their point is and understand their identity. So gypsy is a term that's been used by sedentary people, not by nomadic people, and so we need to be aware that it's a term we're asserting on people. Some people, particularly those from Roma communities, feel quite strongly against the use of that, but then others have tried to reclaim that in the more years. So
Sorry.
what we then see is that we've got a big cluster of different kind of groups. So we've got Romany gypsies, we've got Welsh gypsies, Scottish gypsy travellers, Irish travellers. But if we use Ligos and George's 1995 distinction, basically gypsy relates to ethnic groups linked back to India from the 10th century and coming across, and then traveller is normally linked more to a European indigenous group. Rom and Rome would normally link to people with the Romany language. That's not all Romanians. So some people make that mistake, and that's understandable, but that's not the case. Now, legally, Romany Gypsies are an ethnic group and seen by race equality legislation, and the same for Irish travellers. But we do have some groups which haven't got that status. So New Age travellers, travelling show people, fairground travellers, circus people, waterway travellers, boaters, they all have some sense of ethnic status, but they don't have specific ethnic legislation that fits around that. But we need to understand that for these people, there is a sense in which they have been a marginalized community for many, many, many years. So we can go right back sort of 300-400 years to the time where we can see laws in England and France that were getting rid of nomads. More recently, we've got the climax of the Holocaust, which is known by the Roma people as the Parasmus, the devouring. And we've got this real sense of stereotypes that are done towards the Roma people, and that they're involved in criminal activity, that they've got these sinister sort of magical powers, and that they're promiscuous and that they snatch babies. There's a parallel maybe there for some child protection social workers. So we see that replicates a lot in the media. So My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding takes the worst bits of Gypsy, the worst bits of Traveller, and just merges them together in a real muddle that actually just presents a really negative stereotype. And an anti-Gypsy stance is a political vote winner. So we saw Jack Straw, late 1990s, use it when he was the Home Secretary. We saw Michael Howard in the early 2000s as the Conservative leader use it. And the media continue that stereotype, and we can see that in some of the different headlines in the newspapers there. So we're going to very quickly just whittle through some areas in the discrimination that they face. I'm not going to talk through everything on every slide, but it does mean that when the presentation is there, you will have all that research to be able to come back to. So in terms of housing, fundamentally, there is a lack of housing. There's a lack of sites for Gypsy Roma Traveller. And what we've seen in recent years is that what were known as the transit sites, so where people could stop and then carry on a little bit later, they've basically gone, and that authorities now have a few permanent sites, but nowhere near enough to meet the demand. So Friends, Families and Travellers did some research recently that showed that we were short by about 3,000 sites, in terms 3,000 plots in terms of the work across the country. Often the accommodation is poor, Often it's not managed well when it's particularly in private landlords, and often we're seeing high levels of eviction that then have real issues, particularly around trauma, health, and education. So that then leads us to often see that the GRT communities are transitioned into permanent accommodation, into bricks and mortar. Probably about two-thirds of UK gypsies and travellers are within um, permanent accommodation. And this transition away from nomadic life is really challenging because you're breaking up the social network, you're breaking up the kinship community in which they're staying. We're causing real levels of psychological distress for them. And there's difficulties adjusting to some of the behaviours that are different in terms of things like the way in which household bills work, is it works in a different way when you're living that nomadic lifestyle. In terms of Roma, we often see high levels of multi-occupancy housing, and we often see that there's a real sense in which they will try and live within those urban settings, but they're often moving very frequently from one exploitative landlord to another, which means it's very difficult to build those relationships with them and to understand where they are. In many ways, it's easier to see physically where the sites are for Gypsy and Traveller people than it is to be able to map the Roma people. In terms of crime and justice, the CGPOA, the Crime, Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, made it illegal to park a caravan for even the shortest period on the roadside. Now, that meant that there was a risk that not only could the caravan be impounded, which was their home, not just their vehicle, but there was also the change was that that was then a criminal act, not a civil act. So it meant there was a risk around fine and prison sentences. So we then see this criminalization stereotype, and that's existed for many, many years, but there is very little research to say any indication of that. Instead, actually, Pisani and Williams and then Bazir and Dimitrova actually showed the opposite, that actually the inner cities had much higher levels of crime than the rates around the traveller sites. But what we then see is that we see incredibly high levels of Gypsy traveller and Roma people within the criminal justice system. And there's just some really scary statistics on this slide around the way in which they're criminalised at a very young age. So a number of the cases I work with, young people have been criminalised at the age of 12, 13, 14. And that has a real impact on their life, as you can see from the challenges that they're facing there. And that's then linked to the role of probation, because often we get this concern as to whether or not a site is an appropriate place for someone to be released on license or on bail. And there's a real concern around that in a different way to the way that maybe the road that you or I live down, where we wouldn't have those same discussions about whether or not it's appropriate. There may be discussions around whether or not I should be near the people who were involved in the crime, but not in terms of my own house. And so we see lots of reports concerning those kind of issues, and that then means that there's high levels of Gypsy traveller Roma who are kept in on custody, and we see a higher level of criminalisation. The flip side is we see incredibly high levels of hate crime. We can see that currently at the moment in terms of some of the issues around the recent criminalisation bill that Priti Patel's just brought through Parliament. 77% of those from GTR communities have experienced hate speech or hate crime, but only 13% have sought help from the police. Now, recently, the police have tried to do some work on that to strengthen the guidance and to make sure that they're marking that as hate crime and to make sure that they're able to produce data around that. But that's something that still needs a lot further work around it. In terms of health, we see a lot of significant health outcomes. So we see that normally it's around about 16 years less for a male and 11 years less for a female from a Gypsy Roma traveller community. We see significantly kind of increased issues around maternal and child mortality. Say individuals from GTR communities 20 times more likely to have a child under the age of 18 die. And that then presents significant issues as to how they interact with the health services and how they interact with child protection services. In terms of other health outcomes, we see that there's really low access to antenatal care, and we often see, certainly in Wiltshire, that often Roma women are very late to come forward for antenatal care, partly because there's concerns around costs and the different systems. Here in the UK, we have a much wider and open access to healthcare than there is in Romania. But that then can lead to other different issues for them. So in terms of barriers to that, some of the main barriers are just the practical issues, like you and I have, of trying to ring up and get an appointment, speak to a receptionist. And often there's then those issues around, well, actually, if you don't have relevant address and you don't have relevant ID, then how are you able to prove that you can go to that GP? And that's not something that should be an issue, but it is something that constantly comes up in all the research. We see a lot of issues around discrimination, a lot of issues around health literacy. So, for example, often they will choose to engage with A&E because they feel that there's a more understanding set of staff within those environments. That's not necessarily true, but that's the perception that they're feeling. In terms of education, we see that Gypsy Traveller Roma have the highest absent rates across all pupils. And we see that even though there are different ways in which that can be managed, so for example, there's a legal defence for a child to only attend 200 sessions or 100 days instead of the full 380 if they're travelling as a nomad, there are ways in which that's not being managed properly. Children can be dual registered. So, for example, I've got a traveller family now who are currently travelling and they've got their permanent school within Wiltshire and they're registered as another school currently in Wales where the children are receiving that access and education. And that's something you can always encourage schools to be able to do. But we do see that their attainment is significantly lower. So at key stage 2, we're seeing around about 19 to 25% meeting expected standards. And at key stage 4, we're seeing a lot smaller a group move forward through to secondary education, but we're also seeing significantly lower groups, so 28% of Irish travellers attaining a grade C or above at GCSE English and Maths, compared with 65% across the country. Parallel to that, we then see really increased groups of exclusion. So you can see here that there are really shocking kind of exclusion rates. So we can see the levels of permanent exclusion for ethnicities is much higher, but particularly around fixed period exclusion, temporary exclusion is around about 4 to 5 times higher, which is deeply concerning and has all kinds of different impact for their education. So bringing it into social work and thinking about how do we then work with those families, we see that similarly, even though we talk about anti-oppression and anti-discrimination, that research consistently shows that as a profession, we have that bias, we have that discrimination towards those from Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities. We also see that there's often a lack of cultural knowledge and understanding. It's not something that's taught in the social work curriculum, and it's something that we need to do more to be able to help people. And so that then leads, as with lots of other minority groups, to intervention being at the controlling end of the scenarios. And so that can then lead to sort of a pathologization of families. We have real kind of issues around whether or not we should intervene, whether or not we shouldn't intervene. Is that perceived as racist? How we engage in the culture? But equally, we ignore some of the cultural strengths. For example, the kinship community has some incredibly strong positives to bring, particularly within a child protection focus. And when we're supposed to be looking at that strengths-based practice, we should be highlighting that and celebrating those issues. So in terms of the age-old assessment triangle, we find that often we're very good at looking at the child's development and at parenting capacity, but there's research showing that we struggle to analyse the family and environmental factors. And for the GTR community, that can be really important. We need to acknowledge the trauma of harassment, of eviction, the danger of the temporary stopping places. So I think we need to look at how do we do that, and we need to, as Fisher reminded us back in 2003, to bring those cultural and structural factors into play. In terms of looked after children, we've seen a huge increase in looked after children. So we've gone from 60,000 to nearly 80,000 in the last 10 years. But we've seen a much bigger increase for the Traveller and Gypsy Roma children. You can see the percentage increase is huge. And that then presents a real challenge, because how can a corporate parent pursue the interests of a particular child while at the same time being an active part of the state apparatus that discriminates them? And there's a real challenge for us as social workers as to how we sit within that area. So for us, we're left with that challenge about anti-oppressive practice and safeguarding. We see that many have that fear of social work, and for many that's a real experience. So if I think back to Wiltshire, we know that in the late 1980s, there were a number of times when around Stonehenge, um, the police and children's services arrested many families, took in the region of 100 children into care. And for the parents that I work with today, they were the children back then. And so they have that memory, they have that experience, they have that community sense of that discrimination. So it's not just stuff that they're not aware of, it's stuff that they've lived through themselves. We can often get things wrong in terms of things around hygiene, for example, and the way in which they use different washing areas and different facilities to engage. And we need to think about, how do we engage appropriately with them? And we can still have those concerns around that balance around, is it discriminatory for us to intervene? And it comes back to a lot to the Victoria Columbe report and some of the concerns about whether or not it was right or wrong to intervene, and would it be perceived as racist to have intervened, but then what harm happened to Victoria because social workers maybe didn't intervene? And those are the same challenges that we still have to daily wrestle with. We don't have the answers, we just pose the questions around those. So in terms of effective practice, we know that specialist roles are very rare, but they can have a real opportunity to help other social workers to develop good practice. And we know that the family group conference is something that, because of the kinship community, they naturally do, and they do very well, and is something we can learn from that. So we wanted to highlight at the start of the kind of case studies that it's really important that we intervene in the least intrusive matter. And Judge Headley, in a court case with Brighton Council, just gave this really important quote about, it matters not whether the parent is wise or foolish, rich or poor, educated or illiterate, provided the child's moral and physical health are not in danger. Really interesting quote to wrestle with when you're making an assessment with a family. So we're going to look at a couple of case studies, and I'm going to hand over to Holly for case study A.
Lovely. Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, so as Chris said, my name's Holly Lennock. I'm an occupational therapist and I work in the Children and Young People's Disabilities team at Wiltshire Council. So it's a team of social workers and OTs. Some of our cases are joint worked, some are OT only, some are social work only. It really depends on each child's situation. But before I go into the case study, I just wanted to quickly summarise what occupational therapy is, because some of you might not know. So occupational therapy, or OT, focuses really, it comes down to independence. So we want people to be as independent as they possibly can, regardless of the difficulties they might have. So OTs can work in a huge variety of settings. So in every setting, the role's completely different. So it could be in mental health, on hospital wards, in reablement teams, prisons, the list goes on and on. And occupation is what we're interested in, and those are all those things we do each day which many of us take for granted. So it could be everyday tasks: having a shower, making a snack, getting dressed, going up and down the stairs, anything that you do each day. So my role is specific to children, so I work with children with a wide range of disabilities, 0 to 18, and it's looking at their function in their home environment, so helping them to achieve what they want and what they need to do, and finding ways to support them to do this. So for example, if we've got a child with cerebral palsy who's got left-sided weakness, for example, is having difficulty getting in and out of the bath, we might try some pieces of equipment to try and aid them to do this on their own, or with very limited assistance from an adult or their main caregiver. And then the other side of our role is looking at the house environment itself. So we often do minor adaptations, so putting in stair rails or ramps, and also more major work, which is generally changes which cost over £1,000. And it could be putting in level access shower, or an extension even to provide a ground floor bedroom or bathroom. So if we move on to the case summary, the case that I wanted to share with you today involves a traveller family with young twins, and at the time of the referral to the OT service, they were 18 months old. This was a few years ago now. The family home at the time was similar to the photo here, so it was a one-bedroom touring caravan. It was very small, sited on a family-owned plot. And one twin had recently been diagnosed with a genetic condition. So she presented physically with global developmental delay and epilepsy. She was having seizures throughout each day. She was unable to sit independently at 18 months. And of course, this was then having a huge impact on her ability to learn and develop new skills, which was then resulting in a lot of frustration. And for her, it was primarily self-harm. So she was pulling at her hair to the extent she was pulling her hair out, scratching at her skin. There was a lot of behavioural difficulties as well, which parents were finding really difficult to manage. So essentially, she needed the space to have specialist seating, specialist physiotherapy equipment. However, their home just could not accommodate this. So we had to problem solve and think of what we could do. So thinking about the longer term needs of the child, which is what we do as OTs, although often when the children are small, you don't always know their prognosis, it was anticipated that that wheelchair access would be needed for this young lady in the future. And even just thinking about access in and out of the caravan, if you look at the step in the photo here, yeah, that's it, Chris. She just wouldn't be able to get in and out when she's bigger. And at the moment she's being carried, which was fine, but 18 months she's starting to get heavier. Parents also had concerns that their communal washing facilities would not be appropriate. They were outside in a separate block, some distance away from the caravan. And speaking from an OT perspective, it would just not be conducive to her learning independent personal care skills, for example, as at this stage she wouldn't have even been able to leave the caravan to get there in a wheelchair. So that's it. So if we're thinking about her cultural considerations, the family were managing as best as they could with the facilities they had at that time. However, looking a few years ahead, we needed to really think of a plan for the longer term. And the family were really on board with this. They were keen to consider all of the options that would be made available for them. So just to give you some background about parents, they were both brought up in touring caravans. They were used to moving around frequently in childhood. However, around 5 years prior to having their twins, maternal grandparents had bought the site where they were currently living, and they'd been settled there since. And they didn't wish to move away. So at that point in time, they really wanted to stay settled with their kinship community. They had immediate family living on the site, so this included grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who were all really supportive. And they never lived in a house, they never lived away from the family community. They had concerns about whether or not they would be able to settle into living in a house, whether they would be accepted into a community, and the fact that they would instantly lose their immediate support network. So dad was working at the time, but their income was quite small. They were looking into the benefits that they're entitled to, and they were unable to afford to upgrade their caravan to a sited unit with more space, which was the ideal solution that they had clearly thought through, researched. They knew there was grant money available for disabled children, but they weren't sure quite how it would apply to them as a traveller community. So this is when we started having to figure out what we could do to help them. Thanks, Chris. So usually as OTs, when we go to meet a new family, if a child has a disability, which means they have additional needs and they're inadequately housed, we would encourage the family to either look at private rented or register for social housing. So that's Homes for Wiltshire in Wiltshire, with the aim of finding a home which better meets their needs or at least has the potential to be adapted with our guidance. So as mentioned, this isn't something that the family were going to consider at that time. And the other thing that we very frequently use is the Disabled Facilities Grant, which is DFG. It's used to adapt a child's family home, and it's a grant up to £30,000, which we can apply for. So it can be used to make changes to things like access, so putting in level threshold doors, ramps, or making internal changes to provide a bedroom or a bathroom downstairs. We put in stair lifts or through floor lifts to enable a child to access the first floor and be a part of their family. So the DFG was explored at the time. However, again, it was apparent from the start that there just wasn't the potential to adapt their current caravan. And equally, the DFG doesn't apply to a temporary dwelling, which unfortunately is what the caravan and their home ultimately was considered. So there was a bit of a stumbling block there. The DFG also won't, it can't be used to replace a home. So as Dad was hoping, whether it's bricks and mortar or a caravan, it has to be used to adapt your current home. So we had to look at other ways to support them, to take into account their cultural beliefs and core values around housing, and really put them at the heart of what we were going to do. So we started looking at other legislation to see what we could find. So looking at the CSDPA, it does highlight in section 2 that the local authorities have a duty to assist disabled people in need of assistance, and this can include through alterations to the home. However, the expectation would be that these alterations are done under a disabled facilities grant. So we had to look at the Children Act, which was a bit clearer. Section 17, which is the provision of services for children in need and their families, does state that the council are able, subject to assess need of course, provide accommodation and give assistance in cash. Obviously this is done on an individual basis, and it would be where there are no other means of support which can be found. So at the time this was discussed with our management and our head of service, and it felt that evidencing these key pieces of legislation to senior management was really important in proposing a way forward for this family and finding a way for the legislation to help us get what this family needed. So a single assessment was carried out by one of the social workers in the children's disabilities team, and I've just put some key quotes really that came out of that assessment just to back up the occupational therapy assessment that was done. And the social worker did agree that they desperately needed more space for this specialist equipment, and that it was not in the child's best interest to move the family away from their support network. The family had clearly highlighted their culture and traditions, and they had shown willing to compromise. And overall, it was felt through the professionals' discussions that if we could support the family with the right home environment whilst their daughter was so young, they would be in a much better position to meet her needs and give her the opportunities to reach her potential as she got older, which would then reduce the likelihood of needing social care input in the future. So if we're just thinking about the cost of replacement, for example, or respite, which thousands of pounds per year, the purchase of a suitable home, or at least help towards it, would be so much less over the lifetime of the child. And of course, with all the other benefits of keeping the family together where they wanted to be. So I've obviously had to simplify this for the purposes of today, but I think there were a lot of management meetings held to discuss how we could find a solution for this family and discuss where finances could come from. But I think this slide just reflects the importance of all the professionals working together to gather information. It wasn't just about the social worker, it wasn't just about the occupational therapist, it was about everybody pulling together to achieve the best outcome. And I'm pleased to say that the outcome was a really positive one, and the financing of a new static home was agreed. So the OT at the time did put together a housing specification and requested quotes from companies who make these accessible homes to compare them. And the family moved into their new home, which is very similar to the one in the photo here, the following year, and they still live in it now, and it's working brilliantly for all of them. And I just wanted to reflect really on this case, just to say, sort of linking in with how Chris has described the stigma really attached to traveller families and the discrimination, because at the time there were concerns about what this situation would look like if the media were to become aware of it and the negative slant that was likely to be taken. And so at the time it was dealt with in a very discreet manner within the council to avoid any untoward media attention. However, I think it's also really important to share these positive outcomes because they can be found, and I would encourage any of you working with traveller families to focus on solution-based thinking and challenge the norm where needed. It's important to look at the legislation. We did have to unpick it to make it work for this family, and managers did have to think flexibly to find solutions, obviously while ensuring that public money was spent wisely. But the parents all along had wanted to contribute as much as they possibly could, and as promised, they did sell their caravan, and they did make a payment back to the council once they'd moved into their new home, and I think they were really proud of the fact that they could do that. So I just wanted to give you a very quick update about the family now. So as I say, they're still living in their accessible static home. The young lady and her brother, they're both now 8. She has plenty of space for all of her equipment. She's got a walking frame which she can use independently now to go in and out of her home and play in the garden with her brother. She's also learned how to walk indoors. She uses walls and furniture for support. She's got her own bedroom, which is really important as her sleep is so variable because of her disabilities. And she's got a lovely accessible shower room and loads of space for everything that she needs. So ultimately, it's maximised her development. It's allowed the family to remain a part of their kinship community, which was a huge desire of theirs when they were first referred to our team. And I think if they weren't able to move at that time, the knock-on effects would have been huge. The family would have really struggled to meet her needs, and her development would have been restricted. But she's now thriving, and she's got the opportunity to learn these day-to-day skills, which will take her all the way through into adulthood. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. That's been really helpful to see, and it's great to see some of the feedback in the chat about the work that the team had done. So just moving on to the second case study, we're going to think about a family of 4 children. Now, we've anonymized the family, but the family have very gratefully allowed us to share some of their photos that they've taken recently. So we've got a family of 4 children, and the referral was received following a significantly serious assault of mother by father. The family had been held at child in need following single assessment, but the mum felt that we didn't really get her. We hadn't understood her traveller background, and we weren't engaging well, and she wasn't engaging well back with us. This is a case that I took on around about 9 months ago, and the mum had had, really long-term domestic abuse, probably over the last 10 years. Um, Traditionally, traveller families place a really kind of key aspect on the kinship, the wider family community, but the traditional kind of view of mum then cutting all those connections with dad was really challenging for mum. Now, dad was remanded, given the custody sentence for this serious assault, and parents were relocated, not parents, mum and the children were relocated to a small rural village. But actually, some of the wider family became really aware of where they were staying, and mother was concerned that she was kind of really vulnerable to further attacks and to further concerns of people doing that. And that because she'd lost her wider community, she didn't have a support network for her to rely on. Now, many parents from the GTR community, they really value primary education. In this case, the children had really significant low attendance. We got attendance around about 57%. But actually, we were able to link the family to a local village primary school. And the benefit of that was it's a very small school, it's only got 80 pupils. The children got a lot of really innovative and helpful support from the school. The head teacher was really good at kind of engaging with the family and making sure that the staff were able to meet them where they were at. And the school have worked really well with the limited traveller education service to make sure that the children get that extra support to develop their identity as travellers. And although they're academically low, they've been making really rapid progress. So a couple of things. Dee, when she first started, couldn't write her name, and the joy a month later when she came home from school and was telling us in a visit how she could write a name and was scribbling all over our notebooks to sort of show how she could do it. It was really exciting. And equally for T had really struggled in school because of some of his additional needs, but actually the Senko and ourselves were able to work together to organise a number of referrals to get his EHCP up to date and actually get him the support that he needed and should have had a couple of years ago. So currently the family have no intention to be nomadic, but it's interesting, only last week they suddenly had to go to Wales for a little portion of time due to wider family issues. And actually mum took the time to liaise with the school and has done a dual registration without our prompting to a school in Wales for the children to continue to access that support. Secondary school, though, can be a real challenge. It challenges some of the cultural beliefs that the family have, and the curriculum is seen as being really irrelevant because it doesn't help set them up for the kind of family businesses that a lot of the Gypsy Traveller Roma young people will join. And so we see this real issue around home education and whether or not it's a positive choice, whether or not it's a negative choice. Is it just a choice that they're making because they don't have the full information to make those choices? And in the case with this one, it was really clear that the mum felt that secondary school wasn't um, appropriate for M. She found that there were kind of high levels of racism and discrimination that M had experienced in school, but she was also really concerned about that cultural, they're going to learn about sex and drugs and stuff like that. Um, and so we've had to work with mum to help her to understand a bit more what secondary school is like. And whilst she's not sure that that's the place for M, she is really keen to develop a better home education plan. And so we've been able to work together. M now has a laptop and she's doing some school virtual work and she's doing some work experience that's going to be in a local cafe that's around the corner from where the home is. And that's been really positive for her to see the development and for her to see that actually she does want to engage around some of her English, some of her maths. But the rejection of formal education doesn't mean that there shouldn't be opportunities for these young people. And we need to acknowledge that often the rejection is because there's significant abuse, discrimination, oppression that they face. The studies that we see consistently show that there's high levels of bullying, there's high levels of racial abuse. The Traveller movement only last week shared a whole load more research around this. And we've got this issue that Bopal shared about white racism being distinct from other groups. And we have issues then that lead to that truancy. We've got issues around the exclusion and other kind of cultures that are happening there. So we've got real challenges in how we engage with that. And we need to engage with these issues around purity as well, which for some, particularly Gypsy traveller groups, are significantly important. For other groups, they're not so important. And that's why it's that personalised individual work that we need to do to get to know the family and know what their individual beliefs are. But so it leads us to a really interesting point about what's age appropriate and where do we feel that sits with child protection. So we see lots of really positive strengths. They're developing economic and caring skills that are far stronger than the average peers. If I think about my children and how they're developing in comparison with some of the Gypsy traveller young people, my children are miles behind. And so that, but then equally, there's this issue that at school, the education doesn't feel relevant. They're used to being treated more as an adult at home. So we can sometimes focus on risks. So we think about the dangerous occupations, the young boys using power tools. We think about the girls being left to care for young children. And we have to explore what does that look like. So we need to use some of those different theories. We need to think about the children's rights. So what does it mean about their right to education, their right to safety? But then how much of the Universal sort of Children's Rights Convention, how much that's just a westernized modern childhood? So are we missing the point on it? I don't know. There's interesting thoughts on it. The feminist approach around, the limited of choices and opportunities available to some of the GTR girls. But then again, are we applying a non-traveller feministic theory uncritically, which sees sedentarism and the worldview in a different way? Maybe we need the anthropological perspective where we're prioritizing some of the cultural rights, some of the autonomy, and we're looking at where does that fit and how do we work within that sort of multi building of, of scenarios. So there's lots of different layers for us to think about and to express and to share. And I guess the key I wanted to share was that actually with all of the assessments I do, it ends up with more questions maybe than answers, but it's about journeying through those questions with the family and with the other professionals. In terms of adult social care, we wanted to share just a couple of different examples of some of the assessments that have happened recently in Wiltshire. Um, because for us, there's this sense of personalisation, of promoting well-being that comes through from that Care Act. And yet sometimes we kind of miss the point slightly with that. And so we just wanted to give you a couple of small examples where maybe people have had their voices heard, they've had respect given to their individual views, their wishes, their feelings, their beliefs. Maybe workers have taken time to understand the self-identification made by the family. There's a strong sense of ensuring advocacy, that the family have access to the different information and the various options that are available to them. And then the emphasis of them as the expert by experience to make those decisions regarding their care. And there's a whole load more that we could share with you, particularly around palliative care and around that period running up to death that can help you to engage with that. So what we wanted to do was just very quickly give you a range of voices from the GTR community. One of the questions in the run up to this was this being led by traveller people? So the case study B was put together with the family, and the family have been involved in leading all of that. But then we've asked a number of people from across the country just to share what they would want social workers to hear. So I'm just going to show you some slides. You can read them through yourself and explore them. So we just wanted to end the presentation before we come on to a Q&A um, around the words of Lakover. Lakover survived Auschwitz before becoming a writer and a spokesperson for the Roma following socialism's collapse in 1989. And I just love this quote. It's the end of the war we've survived. After darkness comes the dawn, but after every dawn also comes the darkness. Who knows what's in store for us? So back to Social Work England to help us manage through some of what's been going on in the chat, and to let's have a go at answering some questions. We're not experts, but we'll have a go.
Hi, Chris and Holly, and I'd just like to begin by saying, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and kind of positive commentary that I think is, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure lots of people here, and the comments in the chat would absolutely reflect that people, have fed back about how it's really refreshing to hear the degree of thought and sensitivity with which you undertook the work to meet the needs of the family, and the acknowledgement of the issues of racism and exclusion. And Bert's just put a comment where it says enthusiastic, knowledgeable presentations with clear, positive and focused measures of intervention and outcomes. Thank you. The intervention is clearly based on co-working with families based on accurate knowledge of the family, the community and the strengths. Workers are more prepared to take risks if they have more accurate information. Your work and intervention has given you the confidence to explore options and back those up when needed. So thank you. So does anyone have any questions that we've got about 10 minutes. Someone's put their hand up. TK Vincent.
Hi, thanks very much for a really great two presentations. It was really helpful. I was really interested in finding out how you have recorded work that the families then need for themselves, particularly where there's a high level of illiteracy. Because I know what we've done in Harrow when we've worked with Roma and Irish travellers, but I'd be interested what's happening in Wiltshire.
So I think a lot of it is around how we work together to understand what level of literacy they've got. So particularly for a lot of our Roma families, particularly the Roma women, there's no English language skills. And so actually it's really important, the translation use. So we will often make sure that when we're printing information, we're sharing it in a number of different forms. But often we find actually the easiest thing for a lot of them is to translate into maybe one of their second languages, because English might be their third language. So for example, Spanish is often quite a helpful language with a lot of the Roma people. In terms of the illiteracy around Gypsy Roma and Gypsy and Traveller, I think it's more understanding what their level is, what they're comfortable with, and that's just about that relationship, isn't it? So we will often try and write things with them. We'll often fill forms in together. We'll often help translate letters. So, for example, one of the families I'm working with now, all the stuff to do with their housing is also copied to me, and then I sit and help translate it into their language and double check with them that they're understanding it and that they're happy with what they're signing. I think sometimes we can use advocate services to do that, but sometimes actually it's better to see social workers doing that as well. But that's a really great question, TK, and I'd love to hear what you guys are doing as well.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what we're doing, but really interesting in terms of like the second language thought, because we've done several things. One is we translate. If we have a family group conference, for example, instead of having we have the written version for anyone who can read in their family, because some have more literacy than others. But for those that have very poor literacy or little literacy, we use storyboards,
Yeah.
and we also translate those storyboards into a couple of languages that they use. And we obviously will use an advocate, particularly for the parent that's struggling, so that to make sure that they have enough time to do the things that you're doing now, which is making sure that they translate things, know what their rights are, what do things mean, and break it down in a way that makes sense. Because a lot of the traveling families that we have multiple needs on top of coming from minority backgrounds, so a lot of them have may have a learning difficulty on top of, you know, whatever issues that are presenting, that why they are engaged with social care. So thank you so much, that was really helpful.
No, thank you.
Thank you, TK. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to ask? Let me just check who I'm going to go to first to make sure I don't think. Donna, yeah, you have your hand up.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting presentation, and I was very interested to hear about what you were saying about approaches from schools, and about children perhaps being treated more like adults than they are at school. I was wondering, do you have any examples of positive engagement at primary school level for children who belong to a Gypsy or Traveller group?
So I think that the key starting point is around the curriculum. Say the little school, the rural school in Wiltshire, engaged with the Traveller Education Service, made sure, for example, that when it was Holocaust Memorial Day, that there was real recognition given to the Parajmal as well as to the Jewish community, and acknowledged that for this family that was going to be really significant moment within their spiritual social aspects. But they've also done a lot around just simple things like our Traveller Education Service, that's not that big and you know, definitely under resourced, but has hundreds of books sitting in a storage unit, which meant actually we were able to equip that library with a whole load of brilliant storybooks that include positive examples of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller. So then when they're getting books out of the library and beginning to explore reading and things like that, they're reading about people that they recognise, people that sometimes they already know the story of, but equally their friends are getting those books and hearing about the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller culture. So I think it's those kind of things alongside all the good personalised education practice that teachers do in so many amazing ways for all our families.
That's great. Thank you very much. I just also am part of a school as a governor, and one of the issues there is just trying to ensure that we're engaging the Traveller and Gypsy community well, and that's been a bit more difficult during the COVID times, but that's been really helpful. Thank you very much.
Donna, I've put my email in the group chat. You're very welcome to email me with any specifics, because I know there are a number of issues with COVID and we've deliberately not covered them because we hope we're beginning to come out of lockdown. But I'd be very happy to talk those through with you and to point you in the direction of some of our Traveller education team who might have some wisdom as well.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks, Chris. We've probably got time for one more question if anyone wants to ask a question. If not,
so I think, was Bert trying to ask a question possibly?
Bert,
He's popped up on my screen, I think.
Bert, did you want to ask a question?
Hello, two very quick questions. One was about the funding. I work independently now, but I used to be a manager in a local authority, and the mention earlier on of Section 17 spending made me shudder in my role as a manager. So part of my question was, how on earth did you persuade managers to spend what was needed? And secondly, very quickly also, the notion of engagement and talking to people kind of really reminded me about the need for workers to use genograms in their assessments, because that is such a useful tool in giving you the useful information that you need about families in order to make some brave decisions and to be able to back those up with managers.
Holly, do you want to talk about the Section 17?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at the time our head of service was just amazing, absolutely amazing, and he would push to get what our families needed as much as he could. And I don't know, Fiona, if you can remember that far back, because you were involved in some of those meetings.
I think I don't know whether I was the assistant team manager or the team manager at the time. I'm not, I can't remember now, but we just worked really well together in a multi-agency way, as Holly said. And I think it's getting your evidence and your arguments, isn't it? And discrimination, really knowing the law and the legislation, and then you've got a really good argument. And you managed to achieve it.
And I think in other examples, it's been where we've been really able to highlight the long-term cost savings.
Definitely.
So there was no argument in this particular case that there would be significant cost savings because of the health trajectory. Obviously, in some of the other Section 17 examples, it's much cloudier, it's much unsure as to what the trajectory is. But in this particular case, that's quite straightforward.
And as Holly very articulately said, our aim is independence where possible. And that, yeah, as you say, Chris, that's a really good example of this.
Coming onto the genogram, I really agree. It's a nightmare trying to do on the system. So if I think about the family that I spoke about in case study B, so dad is one of 12, mum is one of 8, and the genogram doesn't stretch that far. And the genogram also doesn't include great grandparents. So I've had to kind of fudge it and do it in all kinds of different ways. In the end, what I've done is just taken a massive piece of lining paper, done it, and then we tried to take a picture of it. It doesn't really show up properly on the system, but it is now in storage. But it was incredibly helpful for us to map the families, particularly because they were living together on the site. There were 14 families, all from the same family on that site, and so it was really key that we understood the way the relationships worked.
And then doesn't that work really well with the genograms with your family group conferences that you were talking about earlier? Kind of works really well together, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's been a real challenge for some of the family group conference coordinators to get used to dealing with much bigger families. So I think my biggest so far was I think it was 22 different families were in the room for it. It was kind of a massive village hall was taken over for it. It was really impressive.
The biggest I've done was 35 with Roma and Traveller families, and that was in London, and that was the longest conference, one of the longest conferences I've convened as well. It was mad. So I do mad props when you did 25.
Yeah, no, definitely. You can definitely win on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. And just like to say one last thank you again to Chris, to Holly and Fiona for what's been a fabulous presentation, just really well balanced with kind of research and kind of practice. And I think it's a really good example of what social work is all about, where social work is informed by working with the family and also informed by research and working in that anti-oppressive, anti-racist way. So thank you very much. We're going to end now. Unfortunately, we've run out of time to take any further questions, so I do apologise. I'm sure we could all sit here for a long time asking more questions, but I just like to remind people that we would welcome your feedback. Kirsty has added a online survey into the chat, which just takes a couple of minutes to fill in, and obviously we'd really value your feedback, and especially, you know, if you've really enjoyed today's session, you know, tell us about it, because actually, you know, that's really good feedback for Chris and Fiona and for Holly, but also for Social Work England about what works in terms of the kind of things that we're able to deliver and support you with. Obviously, for those of you that are also social workers, just to be reminded that this may be a really good session to think about and reflect on in terms of your CPD, thinking about the impact on your practice and the learning that you've taken from this session. So, you know, please use it. Please use this opportunity. And that's it from me. I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody. Have a nice evening. We've got one last day of Social Work Week before we move into next week, when we'll be celebrating World Social Work Day, which Fiona is beautifully demonstrating with her backdrop of a bunty. So take care, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. And thanks very much to Karen, who's done some beautiful signing throughout and must be exhausted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.